Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Be sure to check out our new podcast, The Geopolitical Update, with CDA Deputy Director and former Director of Policy to Canada's Minister of National Defense, Joe Varner. This is the Expert Series. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently expressed concerns about the conclusions drawn by the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, otherwise known as NSICOP, regarding the involvement of some parliamentarians in foreign interference. Opposition leaders Jagmeet Singh and Elizabeth May had differing views on the report, with Singh suggesting serious involvement by MPs in foreign interference, while May downplayed these claims. The ongoing inquiry into foreign interference will now investigate claims of collaboration between federal politicians and foreign powers. The inquiry, led by Commissioner Marie-Josée Haig, affirmed it would utilize documents reviewed by NSICOP within its existing mandate, aiming to finish its work by December 31st. 2 weeks ago in our program, we tackled NSICOP's special report on foreign interference with Stephen Chase, Dick Fadden, and Wes Wark, and this week we'll invite Robert Fife, Philippe Lagassé, Dan Stanton, and Marcus Kolga onto the program for a follow-up discussion to assess the findings of the report, what's happened in the 2 weeks since its release, and what we can anticipate next. First, we'll turn to Robert Fife, Globe and Mail Ottawa Bureau Chief. Mr. Fife, pleasure to have you with us today, and thanks for making time. Can you provide us with your thoughts on the most recent updates since the NSICOP report was released? Maybe you could describe your initial reaction, as well as any important or notable developments in the past week that listeners should be aware of.
Well, my initial reaction, I think, was the same of Canadians and members of Parliament, that it was shocking to see in black and white that some current and former members of Parliament had either wittingly or unwittingly been subject to foreign interference by hostile states. The obvious question is, who are these MPs, particularly one who was identified as meeting with a foreign intelligence officer, which is very close to being treason. The House of Commons has tried to figure out, well, how these names can be revealed, or what more the public should be entitled to know. The Bloc Québécois passed a motion last week that was adopted by all parties to ask Justice Marie-Josée Haig, who's heading the public inquiry into foreign interference, to look into these allegations and to see what more the public can be told about it. And obviously whether any of the names can be publicly released. I don't think that's going to happen. The commission has said that, the inquiry as a semi-judicial inquiry is subject to the rules of fairness, and, and there's reputational damage that they want to be very careful about. So on Tuesday, the House of Commons, Jenny Kwan, an NDP MP from British Columbia, who CSIS has said had been targeted by China, rose as a question of privilege to say that Canadians need to know who these people are. The names we need to be identified in a way that does not jeopardize national security, and how this information was collected. She suggested that they'd be sent to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and they'd be sworn to secrecy, and they try to find a way to get these people's names out, because as she points out, that there's been a cloud of suspicion cast over all members of Parliament, including former members of Parliament, and that and particularly because the NSICOP report identified China and India as the main culprits in foreign interference. It's had it casts a real shadow over Chinese Canadian and Indo-Canadian MPs. And she also makes the point is that getting the names out will put an end to this kind of foreign interference, because governments are involved in this, foreign governments are involved in this, are going to be very, very careful about doing this in the future. And certainly anybody who's being involved in as a sitting member of Parliament or former member of Parliament will be called out. And that will be the end of that issue. So that is where we now stand. We still don't know the names of the individuals. We have to wait, I guess, for the Speaker to rule on Jenny Kwan's motion, and we have to wait to see in December what Justice Marie-Josée Haig says. In the meantime, the most significant thing that all political parties could do is to change the nomination rules so that Elections Canada oversees these, because it's a wild west when it comes to nomination races. And, for the Liberals, for example, you don't even have to be a Canadian citizen to vote. There are no rules, really very little rules in terms of, who's paying for the party paper so that they can vote, whether they're Canadian citizens or not, all of this sort of stuff. But the political parties don't want to act on this because they like it the way this is. But why this is significant is that you can bus people in who are instant liberals or instant conservatives. In many ridings, once you win the nomination, you're guaranteed to win the seat. In Alberta, for example, it's always going to be conservative. In certain parts of Toronto, it's likely to always be liberal. So this is why people have argued and that they need to change. And I think that Justice Hogue is going to recommend this, that they do change the nomination process right away before the next election campaign, so that, we'll have fewer opportunities for foreign governments to be able to influence who is elected to Parliament. Unfortunately, the parties don't seem to be willing to do this.
Various politicians have had quite different responses to the report, with PC leader Pierre Poilievre forgoing access to the classified report, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh saying he's even more alarmed than before, and Green leader Elizabeth May saying the response is overblown. How might this divisive response to the NSICOP report affect our general approach to addressing foreign interference?
Well, it's head-scratching for most Canadians. Everybody is alarmed by the fact that, you have members sitting in Parliament who've been working or co-opted or compromised by foreign governments, and you have everybody saying different things. Mr. Singh said that is very alarming. In one case, it's the person who has committed traitorous acts, but he was very quick to say, but doesn't involve any New Democratic members of the caucus. And the Prime Minister's response was, well, of course, the Prime Minister doesn't talk about the fact whether there are any Liberal MPs who are involved in this, and I know for a fact that they are. He replies, well, any leader says I should be very careful because foreign interference happens at many levels, which is probably very correct. And as for Elizabeth May, I'm just not sure what she's talking about. I don't know. I think the written word of NSICOP it stands, and nobody's really disputed that. She's kind of trying to dispute what is in black and white, and I just don't get where she's coming from.
In April, you and Mr. Chase reported that a member of the Liberal Party warned MP Hendon of CSIS surveillance prior to the 2019 election, with Mr. Broadhurst recommending that no action should be taken over the information gathered by CSIS due to the extremely high bar. Since 2019, do you think that the party's approaches to allegations of foreign interference have changed, especially in light of this report?
No, the Liberal government has not changed. It was only a few months ago when Mr. Broadhurst was before first before a Commons Committee, but then subsequently before the Hogue Commission, where he's still trying to say, both he and Katie Telford, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, are trying to downplay this. Well, you can't take CSIS's word. They make mistakes. There was nothing. We didn't see anything wrong with the Handong electoral process. In fact, what they should have done as soon as CSIS came to them, they should have pulled his papers and said, "You're not running for us." And the evidence is mounting up about Handong. It's in the CSIS, it's in the NSICOP report, it's in a very damning report from the May report from Justice Hogue about his involvement. We saw a testimony of Mr. Dong, who had to admit to the commission that he, in fact, met these Chinese students that were bussed into his riding, and he never told either the commission or anybody else about it until he was on the stand. So there's no doubt here that Mr. Dong should never have been allowed to run for the Liberal Party, and the government has done everything it can to try to play down how they handled the Handong issue, but how they've had to handle foreign interference to begin with. They fought tooth and nail not to have a public inquiry. when we started doing our stories, they were accusing us of being anti-Chinese or being racist. They were tried to downplay the intelligence that we were sharing with the public that was subsequently backed up by testimony before the Hogue inquiry. And it's only because of that May report from Justice Hogue and a number of hearings in Parliament that the government has actually came forward with Bill C-70, which is going to create a foreign agent registry, something the Liberals promised more than 2.5 years ago and stalled on it, where you're going to see foreign interference to be a criminal offense, which is a really good idea. This has been a major problem for the RCMP in being able to investigate things like Chinese police stations and other issues of foreign interference, because the law isn't clear enough for them to be able to do so. And I think this is a good move. And also the fact is that the legislation is going to allow CSIS to be much more forthcoming in telling Canadians or members of Parliament about the extent of foreign interference or where they may be or when they may be targeted. So all of these things are good, but this is not something the Liberals have wanted to do. They were pushed into it every step of the way.
Mr. Fife, now that the report has been out for a few weeks and considering the various instances in which foreign interference has been in and out of the news cycle over the past year or so, what can we expect to happen as this issue continues to unfold?
Well, we already have something that's substantial that has occurred. One, we have a public inquiry into foreign interference, which is enormously beneficial to educating Canadians about the extent of this problem. Immigrant communities in this country are aware of it, but the general Canadian public is not. And the fact that this inquiry is going on and there will be even more recommendations that the government says they will implement, and I'm assuming it'll be on the nomination writing level as well, is very beneficial for the country. And the fact that we have a pretty strong legislation in Bill C-70 that is expected to be passed this week in the Senate and get royal assent by the Governor General is really, really significantly step forward. So a lot has been accomplished as a result of reporting, frankly, that myself and Steve Chase and others started, last January. In, the year before, because of very brave and good people who were whistleblowers and provided us with documentations and information on the extent of Chinese foreign interference in this country. This is not something that's going to go away, particularly in the world we're now facing, with China on the rise. Russia is using everything it can to destabilize Western countries. So this is a really significant issue. It is going to only increase, and that all of us have to be aware of the extent of it and to look for legislative and other means to be able to confront it and combat it.
Thanks again, Mr. Fife. Next, we'll turn to Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor in the Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Philippe, great to have you on again. In a Globe and Mail op-ed, you and Professor Stephanie Carvin co-wrote, you raised concerns about the response to the NSICOP report. Could you outline the balancing act that the government currently must perform between holding MPs accountable and providing too much information to actors involved in foreign interference?
Aside from Poilievre, the other party leaders have read the report or are trying to read the report. We see Prime Minister Trudeau has decided that right now, if he doesn't see any need for action within his caucus, which is one interpretation, Elizabeth May has read it, Jagmeet Singh has read it, and presumably he doesn't believe that there's action necessary within his caucus. And Blanchette will be reading it and has pledged to deal with any matters in his caucus. So that leaves us with the Conservatives, as we say. And although Mr. Poilievre has said he won't read the unredacted NSICOP report, he has said that, or his office has said that he'd be willing to be briefed by CSIS on matters pertaining to his caucus. So hopefully some arrangement can be found that would allow the Conservatives to take a look at it. And if they deem that there is a more serious issue, then hopefully they take responsibility for in their caucus.
If party leaders don't address accusations of foreign interference, what other methods do we have to hold parliamentarians accountable without compromising too much of Canadian intelligence? For example, could parliamentarians use parliamentary privilege to disclose this information?
Well, so the party leaders have agreed to send this over to the Hogue inquiry, and presumably the Hogue inquiry will take a look at it and look at the individual cases, from what I understand. And it may be that as part of their findings, the inquiry urges the parties to take certain actions. So although sending this over to the Hogue inquiry creates a bit of a delay so that the party leaders don't need to do something right away. Hopefully, if there is something that can be done or should be done, the Hogue inquiry comes back and has advice that's worded strongly enough to encourage further action. By the same token, the Hogue inquiry could recommend various steps as part of different ways of dealing with party nominations and a whole bunch of other things that parties deal with themselves. So I'm hopeful that although it is delaying the issue, hopefully the Hogue inquiry is able to come up with some practical advice when it comes to how the parties can handle this. Now, to your point, though, any of the party leaders who have been briefed on this could stand up in parliamentary proceedings and name names. I don't think they're going to do that because they would be strongly advised not to. But if it really reaches a boiling point, that is a possibility.
The response from party leaders has been varied, from Green leader Elizabeth May saying that she feels the findings of the report are overblown, to NDP leader Jagmeet Singh saying that he is more alarmed than ever before, to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying he has quote-unquote concerns about how the report was gathered. What are the effects of these disagreements, and do they bode well for any cross-party collaboration on interference that must happen?
I don't think we need cross-party collaboration on all aspects of it. Fundamentally, what you want is the party leaders to deal with their own caucuses. And party leaders that choose to argue that they either don't believe that the intelligence is credible or that come out and publicly say they disagree with the NSICOP report, well, that can be raised as part of an election, and it can be raised as through various means of parliamentary accountability, as the Conservative leader has tried to do with the Liberals. Where I think a danger lies for the two major parties is if they're seen as effectively trying to sweep this under the rug. Now, right now, that may not be the issue that's top of mind for Canadians, but I suspect that there's enough pressure that's going to build around them that they will need to eventually start to take steps, either within their nomination processes and within their caucuses, to deal with this, because it just does not seem tenable to keep ignoring the issue or hoping it just goes away.
What effect will expanding the Hague inquiry's scope into the allegations made against MPs have on the investigation, and perhaps the public discourse surrounding whether or not the findings of the report are true or not?
So expanding the Hogue inquiry's mandate is obviously putting a lot of pressure on them. They already have a lot going on. They already have a lot to do. When you look at the full breadth of what NSICOP looked at, I mean, you're dealing with a considerable amount of intelligence. I don't know if they'll be able to meet the timeline that they've been given to produce this additional work, but we'll see. What will be interesting and what will be useful is whether or not the Hogue inquiry lands on a conclusion that's somewhat similar to what we have in the redacted NSICOP report. If the inquiry does indicate that there's concerns similar to what NSICOP says, then it reinforces the credibility of the NSICOP report and puts additional pressure on the Prime Minister to act, and on party leaders to read the report and deal with issues that are found within their own party. I think that the Hogue inquiry may use slightly different language, or even if it says much at all, to be honest. So we'll have to see. But I expect that the Hogue inquiry will tackle this in a broader lens, and make broader recommendations. But I anticipate that, much like the disagreement between Ms. May and Ms. Singh, that as long as there's one party leader or one inquiry or one committee that is raising concerns, the issue isn't going to go away.
Philippe, you've previously written that Canadian institutional structures encourage opposition parties to be reactive rather than intrusive in their oversight of defense. At the end of a report going back to around 2016, you hypothesized that the then newly formed NSICOP committee would test party preferences and that the opposition forces will continue to be reactive rather than intrusive, despite the importance of legislative oversight over the executive. How has your hypothesis held up in the years since, especially given the recent NSICOP report? And is there anything that can be done to ensure oversight is less reactive?
So what we argued in the piece is that opposition parties in the Canadian Parliament have an incentive to not be privy to classified information. They don't want to know because being brought into the secret tent prevents them from having critiques and being able to critique the government as freely as they'd like. Because the more you know, the more aware you are of what you can't say or what you can't question or things that are sensitive. So I think what we're seeing this is it's playing out exactly as we kind of found in the research. The official opposition is effectively saying this openly, that they don't want their leader brought into the secret tent precisely because they think it'll dull his ability to hold the government to account. The trade-off, though, is that that means that in this case, the conservative leader is dulled in his ability to deal with problems within his own caucus. So this is raising the limits of this. And just finally, I think what we hinted at in that paper, in that article, is very about NSICOP is playing out. It's still ending up being a very partisan debate, and NSICOP can only get you so far away from that in a Canadian context. We need to have a much better discussion about how Parliament interacts on national security in this country. That merits far greater study and far greater analysis. And hopefully, over the next few years, as the foreign interference file moves ahead, we also have due consideration to how do we raise the level of national security maturity in our legislature.
Philippe, thanks so much for your time. Next, we'll turn to Dan Stanton, Director of the National Security Program at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute and a former CSIS intelligence officer of 32 years. Mr. Stanton, welcome to the program. It's great to host you today. You served as an intelligence officer with CSIS from 1985 to 2017. Based on your experiences serving in Canada's intelligence community, I'm wondering what insights you might have on the challenge of addressing foreign interference.
Yeah, good question. I spent, quite a bit of time working counterterrorism. I spent quite a bit of time with counterproliferation, weapons of mass destruction, but I'd say the lion's share of time was in what we call counterintelligence. Everything from Soviets, Russians, Chinese, and a few others. And a lot of that exposed me to foreign interference in terms of both targeting what we call the diasporic communities and then interference in various levels of government and politics. So I have a fair bit of what we would call practitioner experience from both a field perspective in the regions as well as in headquarters with it. Only comment I could make is that I would say since those days, and certainly subsequent to my retirement, the foreign interference from these state actors has become more sophisticated. It's more finely tuned, targeted than it was when I worked it. So what we're seeing, for example, is particular politicians in a particular party who are being targeted so they don't do well in an election, and particular politicians so that they do well in an election. And that's a bit of a paradigm shift in my mind in terms of that wider CI threat that we didn't have before, because most of my time was dealing with what we call state-on-state espionage, which in some ways has been replaced in a way by foreign interference and foreign influence.
To what extent do you believe that the federal government should be transparent with the public regarding foreign interference issues, and how can they balance this with safeguarding sensitive information?
Yeah, they have to find the balance there. I mean, clearly there needs to be more transparency. We're seeing the results right now from what was initially media allegations to various reviews, inquiry, that Canadians are learning more about national security, they're learning more about foreign interference. And so that in a way does have an effect in terms of mitigating the influence and the impact of it. So I would like to see more, and I think this new disclosure regime with Bill 70 is going to help address that, where the government, in particular CSIS, and to a certain degree CSE as well, are going to be disclosing more. They're going to be disclosing more to people that need to know, but that will lead to more transparency, and that is, without sounding cliche, bringing sunlight in is actually a good deterrent to this type of threat.
Recently, on Tuesday, June 11th, you spoke at the Senate Committee on National Security's second reading of Bill C-70, which was recently passed by the House of Commons. Measures included in the bill have amended the CSIS Act to allow CSIS to share threat intelligence with potential targets of foreign threat actors, including federal levels of government, the private sector, and universities. Does this go far enough in recognizing the new and more varied targets of foreign threat actors and start to adequately address their current vulnerabilities?
It goes very far, and I think it's very good. It's going to be very good for the service as well as national security and Canadians, because up until then and right at the present, historically, the target has always been the federal government. The example, the Soviet Union and China and now Russia and all these states that historically want to get secrets from the federal government. So that's where CSIS would provide the reporting and exchanges from it. But as you pointed out, the target waterfront is broader now. We're looking at universities, we're looking at private sector, we're looking at think tanks, journalists. I can name them. I don't have enough fingers. And so these are the targets of the foreign states as much as the foreign government. So we need to have that pertinent information disclosed to these entities as part of an overall dialogue. Also as part of CSIS's investigation, to have a more holistic investigation, you do need to share and disclose a bit more. You can't just say, don't deal with that university. I can't tell you why because it's a big secret. It's not going to get you anywhere. You're going to have to provide them with a little bit more.
What long-term implications could occur if foreign interference in Canada remains inadequately addressed, especially with a federal election expected to occur in the next year?
I think in some ways we've already seen the long term. The neglect of foreign interference over the years, including previous administrations, is why we're in, I'd say, a bit of a crisis mode right now, particularly with our electoral processes. So when you ignore it and you don't counter it effectively, it just gets worse. But more specifically with the election, I think we need to rebuild or adequately address the lack of confidence that Canadians have in their democratic processes. And what came out of the inquiry was quite clear that while let's say the Chinese or the Indians didn't affect the outcomes, the activities did influence in some ways. So the commission did indicate that there was some effect of all this. And I think Canadians looking at that, and then the NSICOP report that came out the other week, I think it would be reasonable for someone to question the strength of our democratic processes. And, we had the site task force, we had all sorts of other entities that were testifying and the lack of action because of these thresholds and things. And so as a Canadian sitting back, you've got to wonder, how vulnerable are we and how secure and fair will our next election be? We've got issues of nominations. I'm not a political scientist, but I think it's absurd that there's a lack of regulation in the nominations and that we're leaving it to the parties to self-regulate, which it appears they don't want to do. So Canadians are going to look at the election and say, how likely is my vote going to be worthwhile if we've got these foreign actors? And it's not just China and India. We've got Pakistan. We've got a number of others were signaled out as having done some level of interference. Always an eternal optimist. I think it's getting better. I'm really enthused with Bill C-70 and the unity within Parliament to support that. I think that bodes well. And as a former practitioner, I'm not dealing with law enforcement, but I knew that we never really had any consequences for foreign interference enablers in Canada. And this bill will do that, and it will at least serve a deterrent. So I think we still have a lot of work to do as a country, but I think we're certainly headed in the right direction, and I'm optimistic.
Mr. Stanton, thanks so much for joining us today. Before we close out today's episode, we'll turn to Marcus Kolga, CDA Institute Senior Fellow, MLI Fellow, and Director and Founder of Disinfo-Watch. Marcus, it's always a pleasure having you on. Last week we had Stephen Nagy on, and I told him he's now officially had the most appearances on the program, but you might now be tied, or at least a close second. So thanks for always being willing to offer your commentary for the Institute. As the director and founder of Disinfo-Watch, a platform aimed at monitoring, analyzing, and exposing foreign influence operations, I was hoping you could start by giving your thoughts on the intersection of disinformation issues and the findings of the NSICOP report. Could you speak on where you have seen them have most impact on Canada's democratic processes and institutions?
Yeah, well, foreign information operations targeting Canadians are, by definition, efforts to directly interfere with our democracy. Over the years, we've observed these operations targeting minority communities, members of parliament, and activists who are critical of these regimes as well. Malign foreign actors do not limit themselves to just one type of tactic. They employ proxies and influencers who act as domestic transmitters of foreign propaganda and disinformation. The NSICOP report clearly references the use of disinformation by malign foreign regimes to influence and intimidate ethnocultural minority groups, civil society activists, and parliamentarians. These efforts also seek to influence our government's policies at all three levels, aiming to discredit critics of those regimes, or in the case of the Russian government, to incite hate towards Ukrainians and to discredit and dehumanize Ukrainians, or rather Canadians of Ukrainian heritage. The report further outlines efforts by malign foreign actors to directly interfere with Canadian media content by engaging with media executives and journalists. While it mentions PRC actors, we have also observed similar activities by Russia. One Canadian journalist detailed how the Russian embassy in Canada pitched a story that manipulated the Ukrainian family history of Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, to malign and discredit her. This Russian campaign was successful to the extent that these false narratives actually managed to metastasize into and infiltrate mainstream Canadian media. The report also highlights how foreign regimes exploit social media platforms and use proxies to carry out their influence operations. Among the most potent methods used by Russia and the PRC to launder and amplify their narratives in Canada is the use of influencers and enablers and proxies. They may include former diplomats, business people, academics, and even former politicians who benefit from or align with the values of these authoritarian regimes. In the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, we've even witnessed academics, activist journalists, and even a former candidate for a federal political party travel to Russia and meet with Russian foreign ministry officials. Many of these individuals later appeared on Russian state television, on RT, and wrote articles critical of Ukraine, NATO, and Canadian supporters of Ukraine. So it's my hope that C-70 will actually help to curb this kind of foreign interference by imposing consequences and a cost for them.
Our previous podcast on the NSICOP report was released on June 8th. Turning now towards the recent developments regarding the report, most notably the passage of Bill C-70 by the House of Commons, could you outline your thoughts on its effectiveness as an initial step towards a solution?
Well, as someone who's been monitoring, exposing, and fighting to prevent malign foreign information and influence operations for the past 15 years, and as a victim of transnational repression, I'm extraordinarily pleased by the common sense of urgency across party lines and the swift action taken by all parliamentarians to enact this, frankly, this landmark piece of national security legislation. C-70 is a major leap towards introducing accountability for malign foreign actors and the proxies, enablers, and influencers in Canada who support their operations and help carry them out. The legislation provides significant protection to Canadian activists and vulnerable communities, especially those who are vulnerable to authoritarian transnational repression. The Foreign Influence Transparency Registry, established by C-70, will require anyone acting in association with a foreign regime to advance their interests to register, and it criminalizes those who work against the interests of Canadians. Now, some of the arguments I've heard recently about Bill C-70 potentially limiting Canadians' ability to freely express themselves, I think are just false. C-70 does nothing of the kind. The bill, in fact, protects the rights of vulnerable Canadians who are targets of foreign transnational repression, allowing them to speak their minds freely without fear of intimidation or of being silenced. All it does is, frankly, demand transparency and accountability, which are the cornerstones of any properly functioning democracy. even those morally challenged Canadians who might advocate for Canada to, say, drop its sanctions against Russia, for example, they can continue doing so, provided they register under the Act. By doing so, our elected officials at all levels of government and the media will understand exactly who they're speaking to when approached by groups or individuals seeking to advance the interests of foreign regimes. Now, the proper implementation and eventual enforcement of this act may be a much more significant challenge than this remarkably rapid passage that we've seen of the legislation. However, the all-party support the bill received makes me somewhat optimistic that over the coming year, the government will provide sufficient resources.
Federal officials, party leaders, and other key members of parliament have expressed different levels of concern regarding the threat posed by current MPs, potentially colluding with hostile states. How can we get Canadian elected officials to take the threat of foreign interference more seriously, and what measures or practices should be adopted to do so?
Well, I don't think there's anything particularly novel about individual MPs or ethnic minorities being targeted by foreign influence operations. In 1945, we became aware of Soviet-era intelligence operations specifically targeting members of parliament and leaders of diaspora groups, thanks to documents stolen by Russian defector Igor Guzenko. The methods, the tactics, the procedures used by the Russians have clearly evolved since the Cold War, but the objectives remain largely the same, and those are to manipulate public opinion, influence public policy, and to undermine our democratic processes. We've observed Russia actually engaging in the creation of AstroTurf groups as early as 2015, following the illegal occupation of Crimea. Back then, the Russian embassy helped organize and support fake community organizations and groups that advocated for a softer Canadian stance on Russia's aggression towards Ukraine and against Magnitsky sanctions and sanctions at all on Russia. But their efforts were exposed in Parliament by two MPs, John McKay and James Bazan. And once those efforts were exposed, that behavior just stopped. We haven't seen Russia try to create a fake grassroots organization or a community organization that's supported or funded by them since then, although there are indications that they're continuing that work now. Reports also outline how foreign governments have targeted MPs who have challenged the positions of authoritarian regimes. Earlier, I mentioned the campaign to discredit Canada's deputy prime minister by Russian-aligned actors. Russian propagandists also attacked Prime Minister Harper and then Immigration Minister Chris Alexander ahead of the 2015 federal elections. The AstroTurf group I mentioned before also urged Russian voters to vote against the conservative government back then and urging them to vote for the Liberals, believing that the Liberals would be softer on Russia. Now, sadly, Canadian intelligence seems to have missed that episode, and much of Russia's intelligence operations inside Canada, focusing mostly on PRC activity over the past few years. Now, this is not a criticism, but it is just an observation. We're now all well aware of how the PRC supports candidates for office and elected officials that it approves of. And this occurs, of course, at all levels of government. We're also now aware of PRC efforts to attack and discredit parliamentarians, officials, activists, and diaspora minority groups who are critical of the regime or are advocating simply for human rights. Now, I think that we can effectively stay on top of these efforts by simply regularly engaging with civil society groups, with activists and leaders of vulnerable minority ethnocultural groups such as the Tibetans, the Hong Kong community, the Uyghurs, Ukrainians, Taiwanese, and even Baltic Canadians. Foreign influence awareness and media literacy training should also be mandatory for any candidates for political office and their campaign staff.
A key finding of the NSICOP report is that non-traditional targets, including individual MPs, are increasingly being sought out by foreign threat actors. How can Canada stay ahead of this issue and prepare to adequately address new and evolving potential sources of aid for hostile states as they emerge?
Well, for years, I've been advocating for mandatory foreign influence awareness and media literacy training for all elected officials at every level of government, including their staff and any future candidates. Of course, this won't prevent malign foreign actors or morally compromised elected officials from going underground. But with this new legislation, we're now clearly articulating the consequences and real costs for failing to be transparent about foreign influence. And I think that this will help reduce at least some of this threat activity in the future. But Canada would also benefit from additional legislation and regulations to bring elections at all three levels of government under the purview of Elections Canada, as well as nomination contests and leadership contests at both the federal and provincial levels. And recent amendments to the Election Act have actually begun to address this by including, quote, potential candidates in the legislation.
Marcus, it's always such a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us again. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. I'd like to give kudos to our research assistants Gabrielle Picton and Heather Lee for organizing and conducting research for this episode. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.